Yeah.
There's a reason.
No, I have 4 ladies. In fact, I want to connect her with the weekend.
Yeah, hit the road.
Great. So thanks for coming out tonight, everybody. My name's Jeff, and the topic of tonight's talk is tokenized fundraising and governance. So what does that mean, and why should you care? How many people here are familiar with ICOs? How many people here have actually invested in an ICO?
What is, you get arrested, you have to be careful.
Yeah, right? Can I talk about that? No. So, for those who may be a little bit less familiar, I'm just going to give you a quick 5-second explanation. Initial coin offering is a fundraising mechanism for a blockchain project where essentially you accept funds in the form of some kind of cryptocurrency, whether it's Ether or Bitcoin or even fiat currencies, and in exchange you give your investors some type of token, which then gives the investor or the purchaser of the token the right to use your platform once it's eventually built out. So that's the fundraising half of tokenized fundraising. Now, this obviously has blown up. I think in the first quarter of 2018, we've seen something like $6.3 billion of US dollars invested in the ICO industry, which is in the first quarter more than all of 2017 combined. So this is a accelerating trend which doesn't show really any likelihood of slowing down or reversing. But there's some pretty serious problems with the traditional ICO fundraising mechanism. Basically, you're just handing money over to the managers of the project, and there's no guarantees. You get essentially use of the platform in the future, but there's no voting rights or any kind of a dividend with this investment. It's essentially a yieldless security. So lately, you've been talking to a few people here in the Ethereum community about some potential governance models that can go along with ICO fundraising, and that's going to be the topic of tonight's talk. So, again, we're just going over the ICO model. Why is the ICO model problematic? Okay, so first of all, you put a whole bunch of money into this project, but it's not like investing in an equity, right? You know, with an equity, at the end of every period, whether it's quarterly or annually, you get some kind of a dividend distribution of the profits of that joint venture. You get nothing like that with a token. You're never going to get a dividend from a token. You also have zero oversight. So as an investor, it's not like you get a seat on the board of this company or some kind of a voting share. Essentially, you have no control over the project whatsoever. So if you've given money to the development team and you don't like what they're doing, too bad, you're out of luck, sorry. And so the more I thought about this, it really seems odd to me the way that for the first time with these tokens, you have this mixing of the concept of ownership and payments for a service, which is something that's kind of new, which we haven't really seen before in the equity world or any security for that matter. And what I mean by that is essentially you participated in the crowd sale, so you've given money to the development team, you've got a token in return, and essentially the way that you realize a financial gain from that is if the project takes off and becomes successful, hopefully the price of the token will go up, because if anyone wants to actually use the project, they have to buy some of those tokens from you to actually use that service, whatever it happens to be. And so that's how you realize your gain. But if you actually want to become a customer of this service, there's really no way to do that except for by spending those tokens that you own. So the analogy that I like to use for this is it's kind of like, if you think about at Amazon, if every single time Jeff Bezos wanted to actually buy something on Amazon or watch a video on Amazon Prime, he'd actually have to like sell Amazon stock to do that, right? It doesn't really make sense. It's a very odd mixture that creates a lot of really perverse incentives. So, and I don't want to just totally throw the baby out with the bathwater either. There's a lot of real innovation that comes with the token model that we do want to retain. So from a regulatory standpoint, it's actually fantastic. With tokens, because as soon as you invest in that token, you've now got this record of your investment on the Ethereum blockchain or on another underlying chain, it's essentially an automatic registration. So anyone in the world can see that, okay, John Doe now owns this share in this joint venture or this company. It's on this public blockchain, which anyone can see. No extra paperwork required, right? So it essentially has this amazing disintermediation effect where you can invest in companies or projects in a really direct way, right? With you don't need to hire a lawyer, you don't need to do any really complicated filings, you don't need to do a public offering, anything like that. You just need to throw up some code online, people can send you money, and it's done. It also has the added benefit of transaction tracking. So once you purchase your initial security, and then you actually want to sell that to someone else and it changes hands, now you've got a record of that trade, which again, is automatically captured in the blockchain, right? So there's this whole reporting tool that's actually just built into the protocol layer and requires no extra paperwork or any kind of red tape on top of that. So this is an amazing innovation, and this is really something that I think we want to take advantage of. In addition to this idea that I came across recently, which I think is fascinating, which is self-executing regulation, right? So there's certain laws around how you can buy securities and who can buy them and how long you have to hold on to them for. So for instance, if you're an accredited investor and you purchase a restricted security in a company, so you're like an early investor in a new startup, a lot of times you actually have a lockup period with that, where you can't then turn around and sell that security for anywhere from 6 to 12 months. And right now, you need kind of an external enforcement mechanism to make sure that that happens, right? The SEC spends over $2 billion a year just tracking these things and making sure that people are actually trading securities the way that they're meant to. Whereas with securities on the blockchain, you can just build that rule into the code, right? So if I'm, investor XYZ and I purchase a restricted security in this new company, and I'm not allowed to sell it for 12 months, you can actually build that timer into the contract itself, so I literally can't do it. If I do, it'll just throw an error and it's impossible. So, as much as blockchain is typically seen as kind of the purview of these anarcho, libertarians who, want everything to be totally decentralized and no government, it's actually a regulator's wet dream, right? Because you can literally build the rules into the currency and the securities itself. So it's the kind of thing that regulators get excited about. I don't know. Anyway, so what we really want to accomplish here is to maintain all the benefits of the token system while also creating more protections and oversight for the investors. So why is this interesting? Why does this matter? Because if you're an investor in an ICO, you want to know that you've got protections in case the team decides to just run away with your money, or they're doing something which they said they weren't going to do, or maybe they're just not doing a very good job. You want to actually have some sort of hedge or oversight over your investment. And it's also would be good for the development team's perspective to make the choice to actually self-regulate more. Because again, this is an industry that is rife with pretenders and scam artists, and it's become a huge problem. So one way that development teams can actually make themselves stand out from the crowd and differentiate themselves as someone who's a credible project with real goals that they're going to accomplish is by essentially taking on restrictions themselves that they agreed to use. So in the interest of this, what we've developed here is a two-tier model. So it involves two different smart contracts. The first one, which we call the equity token, is very similar to the articles of incorporation of a regular company. And then you have the operational contract, which is very similar to the operating agreement. It's essentially the rules that all of the members and stakeholders in an organization have agreed to abide by in their interactions. So this is still very much a work in progress. I really invite everyone to think critically about what I'm saying here. If anything I say doesn't make sense, or you notice a bug in the logic or the code, please just put your hand up, let me know about it. The reason I'm here tonight is because I want to stress test this thing and I need some feedback. So please don't worry about hurting my feelings. Just throw out the hard questions there, and I would really appreciate it. So the actual contract itself, if you want to read the whole thing, if you're a Solidity developer and this is the kind of fun stuff you like to do after work, please feel free to go to GitHub and check it out. I'm not going to go over the entire thing tonight. I'm just going to focus on the parts of the contract that really make it different from other contracts. So the first couple methods just implement ERC20, which is kind of the standard for Ethereum tokens to make them tradable on decentralized exchanges. So I'm not going to go into any of that. What I really want to focus on tonight is how you can distribute dividends, create a budget, elect officials for the organization, and then ultimately wind down the company. These are the kind of the first four features or functions that we created for the equity token. So again, I'm not going to go through every line of code here, but again, for the developers, I just want to get this up here in case anybody sees something that doesn't look right. First function is elect a dividend. So this is essentially how any member of the company can propose what they think the dividend for that period for the organization should be. And this would then get taken out of whatever remaining amount of Ether is still in the contract. So you can select any number you want. You just send in an integer to this function as a dividend. And then what essentially that does is it moves your support for that dividend from whatever the prior value was that you were currently supporting to the new value. And the way that it calculates your voting power is a pure function of the number of tokens that you own. So in this organization, as members own more tokens, that's exactly correlated to the number of votes that they have and the amount of say that they have over the organization. So then if enough people vote for one particular dividend, and it's greater than this quorum value, this is something that you'll see a couple times in the code. This is basically what the company sets as their minimum majority that the votes need to be a passing measure. If enough people vote for one particular dividend that's greater than the quorum, then that gets assigned to be the new dividend. So again, it's this idea of just being able to shift your support from one particular dividend to another based on the number of tokens that you own, and then the dividend gets distributed. So this is a function that can only get called by the administrator of the contract, who kind of acts like the chairman of the board or the CEO of the organization. And as soon as this gets called, it can't get called again until the period elapses for the next period. So again, when you create this contract,
so on the elect dividend, what happens if you have token holders that don't vote whatsoever?
So the default is 0. So but when the contract gets initiated, all of the votes are defaulted to 0. So if someone doesn't vote, then it just basically gets set to 0. But if you voted in the last period and you haven't changed your vote since then, it'll default to whatever your prior value was. Yeah, and actually, that's a good segue. When you instantiate the contract, automatically all of the tokens and voting power are assigned to the administrator. There's also the same address that creates the contract. So in order for anyone else to be able to vote, the administrator has to move their tokens over to them. So when the dividend gets distributed, once a quarter, once a year, whatever the period is, then the actual amount of Ether that's in the contract will then get broken down into a number of different addresses for all of the members of the organization. It doesn't send the Ether. You have to call the withdraw function to actually get your Ether out. But it'll break up the total dividend as a percentage of what your token balances are divided by the total number of tokens. Now, the reason I've highlighted this is because this is a problematic function. You should never have looping in Solidity functions, right, or in Ethereum, because there's a potential that you can run out of gas here. If your organization gets really large and you have too many members, this could be an out of gas error. So one reason why I say don't try this at home. But I wanted to get this out here because I wasn't able to come up with a better solution yet. And so if there's any Solidity developers out there in the audience who have a different idea about how you could essentially iterate over the members to decide who gets what, very open to suggestions.
You could make it to where they are approved to withdraw, and then just allow each member to withdraw.
Then you don't define the values beforehand, but calculate them on the fly for every member who just wants to withdraw.
So that was, if I'm understanding you correctly, both of you, that was the original design. The problem then is when someone, say no one's withdrawn yet, right? And you have the initial values. As soon as I go in and withdraw my percentage, now the total amount has decreased, so I can call it again, call it again, call it again. So that's why that's kind of hard to do that way. Go ahead.
How do you avoid circumstances? If there's a time delay between the vote and the distribution of the dividend, or it's on the onus of the person calling it, how do you avoid situations where I were to acquire a large number of tokens at the vote, vote for a large dividend, sell my tokens before the distribution, and so, it seems to me like an arbitrage here in the sense that you can actually force the vote, have a bigger dividend, sell your tokens before the dividends, get the dividend, and all of a sudden you've actually acquired a lot more dividends than other people would perhaps wish.
You could put a delay though on that if you wanted to, the logic.
Time locking.
You could say 6 months you can't sell your tokens. I had an earlier question after
Well, let me just make sure I'm understanding your question. So you're saying that if I vote for a large dividend, but then in between when the dividend is voted on and when it actually gets released,
Everybody sold my big
I've
block.
gotten rid of it, and so...
Or I acquire a big block before the vote for a huge dividend, sell the block, receive the dividend, and all of a sudden I seem to have an awful lot of tokens without much risk.
No, that's a fair question. And again, the dividend is being distributed in Ether, not tokens, just that everyone's on the same page about that, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying could definitely happen. I mean, there's nothing to stop anyone from going into the market and just purchasing any amount of this organization's tokens that they want at the market value, and you essentially could become the majority shareholder, right?
It's a temporary measure.
You can do whatever you want. I would say, though, that it should be prohibitively expensive to do that if this contract has a lot of Ether in it. That's kind of like, you can think about it like the breakup value of the company or the book value.
Many of these ICOs are very small.
You have liquidity issues when you go to buy it or
All I'm
sell
saying
that
is that if there's a time delay
One
between
second,
the
but
vote.
wouldn't you, because by virtue of the fact that you've drug up this huge dividend, you've devalued the value of the equity. So when you go to sell it after, no one wants to buy the equity from you to cover back your expenses because you've crushed the company by dragging out this huge dividend. Do you know what I mean? So what you were saying was you drag out the dividend and then you make your money back by selling the equity that you bought. So you've got this big dividend and then you make your money back. You're never going to get back the same value that you spent on a share. If you took a share for $1 and you drug out all the value in the dividend, when you went to sell it, people would say, I'm not paying $1 for that, it's not worth $1.
Like there should be a market mechanism that kind of keeps that from
Sorry?
happening. Like if the book value of the contract is 100 Ether, it should cost you 100 Ether or more to actually become, the majority shareholder and be able to have total control over it.
I understand
So,
the economic argument. That's not enforced in code.
No.
To give my background, I've been an FX and derivative trader since the 80s. And where I'm coming from is that the sharks are in the water. And I think you need to think very long and hard about how this functions, both as a market and also as code. That's all I'm saying. I'm just saying, my arbitrage mind immediately goes to like all the corner cases of what your code is.
Yeah.
So you ask for feedback. My feedback to you is, don't trust the market if you can actually enforce it in the code.
Okay.
In some way. That's
I
all.
get what you're saying, yeah.
Because I've made a very good living over 30 plus years arbitraging markets.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd like to talk to you more about that afterwards.
Just some feedback.
Thank you.
And I take your point. There's an economic model, there's a code model. Just letting you know where I'm coming from. I've done very well in 30 years arbitraging markets.
No, and at the danger of agreeing with you. No, but you are right, because ultimately, if you follow it through though, let's say there's a treasury, and let's say in the treasury let's pick an arbitrary figure, 100 ETH, and you have that dividend paid out, then it may not matter anymore. You're like, you know what, I spent 50 ETH on all this equity, I made 100 on the payout, I don't care if no one buys it. This company crashes, I walk out with 50 ETH profit.
As I say, the sharks are in the water.
If you
Sorry,
good point.
I didn't mean to
No, you're good.
absorb so much
Did
time.
you have another?
This is an earlier point, something to be considered, which is taking the quorum and apply that to only those who voted. So to say 75% is the quorum, you look at the shares, and as long as you have 75% that are in favor of just who actually voted, then you encourage people to actually vote, and you look at the ratio from that, and you avoid what I think you were pointing out, which is if a bunch of people don't vote, you may never reach quorum.
Yeah, you could definitely do it that way. I think you would need to build in some sort of, again, a timer where you say, okay, the voting period has begun, and you have to vote in here, and then we're just going to count up all the votes for that period.
Yeah.
But the reason that it's implemented this way is it's just kind of, you can do it without the timer. Like at any moment, if the quorum is reached, then it flips over, but that's definitely another way to do it for sure.
I think it's obviously not airtight, but kind of going on what you were saying, if there's an administrator who has private privileges on the contract, maybe there can also be a tranche of tokens to prevent a certain quorum being reached without that tranche being touched, or maybe that being locked away in a sort of Genesis block kind of style situation. Is that a possibility where you can?
I'm not sure if I'm following you.
Okay, so you generate a circulation of all the tokens you're going to have at the beginning, and you also have a quorum that you need a certain number of those tokens. Is that correct, or a certain number of members?
Certain number of tokens. So if there's 10,000 tokens, you need 5,001 to pass a measure. Yeah.
Right. So in a typical, or what I assume is a typical corporate situation, the board holds a certain percentage of the stock to prevent, a major player coming in and
Sure.
preventing it. Is that possible with this?
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely do that this way. Again, this is sort of a pure democracy where it's just purely based on the number of tokens. So yeah, if the original founders of the project decide to maintain a controlling share, then they can really exercise that tight control if they want, or maybe they hold 45% so that it would be difficult to come in and become an activist investor. I mean, you could even have two tiers of token, right? You could have, within the same contract, you could have a different mapping that only tracks maybe there's 100 board member tokens, right, that are kind of like Class A and Class B shares. Some of them have voting rights, some of them don't. So yeah, I mean, I think really you can build in as much flexibility as you want with these smart contracts to make it like any kind of regular equity in the real world that we have today. And that's really kind of the purpose of this whole exercise, is to kind of explore, all right, if we wanted to make an ICO look more like an IPO, what would that look like, right? Like how can we actually replicate what exists in the real economy in the blockchain world? So yeah, I think definitely.
To serve what purpose? If it's just replicating?
Sorry?
If it's just replicating, what purpose does it serve?
And again, that's a really good question. For me, the main purpose is disintermediation. So if you can do everything that an IPO or that a typical corporate structure accomplishes without having to pay lawyers $100,000 to do it, to me that's a
on
win.
the front end, but as soon as someone gets upset, no, I'm not pointing at the customer. I'm saying on the front end, that's correct. But on the back end, if someone gets upset and they want to call in mediation or want to call in lawyers, you're still susceptible to the laws of the country.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll get to that in the outstanding issues slide, because that's a very good
Just
point.
one other last point. If a large shareholder dies and no one has access to those coins, going back to the quorum thing, those tokens are.
Yep.
So that's
They're
an
lost.
issue with that, and that hasn't happened yet. But I could definitely see that happening.
Yeah. So I mean, I think like a multi-sig.
Satoshi's dead.
No, that's also a problem there for sure.
You'd have the beneficiary features.
So just to move on a little bit, again, please continue asking questions. This is great. The electing a budget function is almost exactly the same as electing a dividend, but again, it's just a budget number instead of a dividend. That budget then gets distributed to a particular Ether address, which is defined by the administrator. So this ideally should be another smart contract. This is like the operational contract that I mentioned in the first slide, where really, if this contract is like the Articles of Incorporation, you want to have another smart contract that's like the operating agreement, which defines how can the project owners use the budget and kind of what are the restrictions around that. So you really don't want to just send this to like an address that's controlled by a user who can then just spend it willy-nilly. And really, that operational contract is a much bigger, complicated project than just what we're showing here tonight. But it's also much more interesting. So yeah, and then again, once the budget's been distributed, it can't get distributed again for another period. So really, this is one of the core functions of this concept, which is this kind of idea of drip feeding the project management team so that you don't give them all of the ether up front and then they can just go, fuck off to Barbados or whatever they want to do with it. The investors actually retain the majority of control of the funds, and they basically only distribute it as the team maybe has met certain milestones, right? So maybe there's a certain epic that you say, all right, once the team has actually developed a prototype, then we give them the next tranche, et cetera, et cetera. This is actually similar to a concept that Vitalik suggested in his DICO description, which is this idea of a tap. Which is, in that version, it's a kind of an automatic function where every week there's a certain amount of way that can be distributed to the team. This requires a little bit more manual intervention, but yeah, the owners of the company can up or lower this number however much they want, and they can decide, all right, when does the next payment actually get released to the development team. And the second to last function, I like to be the administrator. Again, this is how you decide who that person is who gets to actually hit the button to distribute the dividends and the budgets. He only has those two powers in this organization. It's possible that he or she could have many more powers if you wanted to find them in the contract, but essentially this is a liquid democracy. So again, at any time when you are unhappy with the behavior or the performance of the administrator, if enough support goes in for a new person that exceeds the quorum amount, the administrator is automatically changed. So there's no concept in this version, this implementation of, okay, you're elected for 1 year, 4 years, whatever. As soon as he's doing a bad job and you want to change that person out for someone else, I mean, this could be like one day to the next. It's totally immediate. But again, to your earlier point, you could also build in timers with this as well. Maybe you want to give the administrator, kind of some runway, some time to prove themselves. But this current version is completely liquid. And then the final function is the wind down function. Again, this is another concept that Vitalik introduced, which is essentially the self-destruct button on the entire organization. So if it turns out that the development team is doing something malicious, or they're doing something that's fraudulent, or maybe they're just not achieving their goals, they're just failing. If a majority of the members of the company decide that they want to actually withdraw their funds, they can do this by voting. And again, the remaining amount of funds in the contract are automatically assigned to the Ether accounts of all of the members in proportion to their holdings, and no more budget is available to the development team. So the contract itself doesn't actually go away. It's still there forever because the members have to actually withdraw their funds, and so you want to give them time to be able to do that. But there's just no more money in the contract. So the development team's free to continue working for free if they want, but there's no more money.
So people can continue to send money to that contract theoretically?
Sure. And again, if you want to introduce timers, maybe you could say, all right, you've got a month to take your money out, and then we're going to self-destruct the contract, whatever you want to do. If you want to be a good Ethereum citizen and clean up the blockchain, that'd be great.
You want to do that?
Yeah. So then, again, this is kind of a placeholder for that operational contract, which is the contract that actually controls the budget. This is something which is an active development, and we hope to come out with a version of this in another couple of weeks. But in the meantime, I definitely encourage everyone to check out Colony. They're a really awesome project. They have this whole very complicated white paper that it's fun to read, even though it's kind of long, where they structure an organization based on this idea of reputation, which is really interesting. Then Gnosis actually has a good multi-sig wallet, which addresses the problems that we mentioned before about a member dying. Like if you implement multi-signature, then you can still get the money out, which is good. So again, this is kind of a placeholder, but this is something that we will hope to be introducing in a couple weeks. To the gentleman's point in the back, this isn't legally binding. So what are the issues with this approach? What are the potential pitfalls? It's not a real contract, right? I mean, smart contracts are such a new invention that we don't really have any precedents in the courts of law about, will these actually be enforceable? So all the functions that we've gone over tonight are actually self-executing, so this isn't a problem. But if you wanted to build out a more complicated organizational structure, where you actually had some language in there that needed to be enforced by an external entity, that could definitely be a problem. Because it's not technically legally binding yet. I mean, again, I really hope that someday courts will recognize smart contracts. But in the meantime, you need to rely on on-chain or smart contract mediation. So one thing that you can define within the organization, which we haven't touched on here, is, okay, in the case of a dispute, we both agree on this mediation party to resolve the dispute. And a couple guys, Mike Golden, I think his name was, wrote an excellent paper on this called Delphi, which is their implementation of a smart contract mediator. And you can check that out here at hidden.computer. It's a weird personal website. It's got a lot of really interesting papers on there about mediation and token curated registries, which if you're not familiar with are really cool. Again, another problem we touched on, don't loop. It's a bad idea. Do as I say, not as I do. And this is a security. So, you know, I'm just going to come out and say it. If you were to set up an organization like this and you were to want to invest in it, you need to be an accredited investor. Or, you know, there can only be 35 of you. If you're not accredited investors, basically you have to actually follow all of the rules that the SEC puts out in Reg D. Because 99% of ICOs today are securities. The SEC has come out and said that they're securities, and they're basically all in violation. So this doesn't help you circumvent that at all, right? You're still investing in a security by participating in this organization. So although this does remove a lot of the red tape around that, it doesn't remove all of it. You're still a citizen of the United States. You know, you still live in the real world. You got to abide by these things. So these are the potential issues that I see. If you guys can think of any more, I would definitely like to hear about them. So what are the next steps? Where are we going with this? This is part of the larger project that I'm working on, which I'm calling Block Law, which is basically a collection of tokenized contracts for real-world things and events. So we're sort of interested in this idea of actually applying blockchain technology to things like, you know, basic loans, employment agreements, any kind of contract that you can have on paper. What would that look like in code? So if anyone's interested in contributing to that or would like to kind of see what that looks like, again, we have the GitHub repo here, and if this gets any traction, you know, I'll move it into its own repo. It's not my private one. But really what I'm planning on doing over the next week is I'm actually going to launch a fake version of this organization on the test network. So basically going to set up a fake company with its own ERC20 token, which anyone here is more than welcome to buy a fake piece of. And you know, we'll just basically trade them amongst ourselves and make sure the thing actually works. You know, I've tested it on Truffle, got, you know, a fair amount of unit testing, not 100%. But this, really the hard part is with these smart contracts is, you know, what happens when you get real live squishy human beings interacting with these things in kind of unpredictable ways. So this is kind of my my request or my call to action for anybody in the room who would like to participate. Again, you don't have to send real Ether, it's just on Rinkeby. But I would like to actually just get this thing set up and get a few people interacting and trading the securities among themselves just to see if it breaks, you know, just to make sure the thing actually works. So if any of this is interesting to you, if you'd like to check out the repo, you're more than welcome to fork the contract, add some functionality, play with it yourself, or just shoot me an email at the bottom there, and love to talk to you. So that's it.